Hi everyone, I'm Alex Konrad, a senior editor at Forbes and the co-creator of the Midas List Europe. It's my pleasure to have with us Sophie Cairns from TrueBridge Capital Partners, our longtime partner on the Midas List. Sophie, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the Midas List Europe.
Thank you for having me, and from TrueBridge, I think we're super excited for the list this year, as we are always, and always to work with Forbes. It's an incredible opportunity.
What has been the biggest highlight or the top person on the list that stood out to you?
Certainly. So when thinking about how this year's list came together, one thing that we noticed that there were a few newcomers. So one which stood out was Eyal from Passion Capital. She ranked at 15 this year with companies such as Monzo and Butterbox. And another exemplary newcomer was Gilly Renan from Cyberstarts, and driven by a great company Wiz. And then not a newcomer, but someone who did jump up the ranks a lot, over 10 places, was Gil Dimpner from Angular Ventures.
That's awesome. And could you tell us a little bit about who's number one this year?
Of course. So this year, our number one was the very impressive Eyal, and from Entree Capital. And when we think about his different deal drivers, it was interesting to note that many of his companies, he'd over 2 scores of qualifying companies. Many of them were European.
Is that not common, that often you have European investors on the list who have American companies still driving their placement?
So I think when we think about venture capital and how the global Midas List and maybe the past European Midas List has been shaped, we think of often this concentration of tech innovation happening in Silicon Valley. But I suppose what we're seeing now is more distribution of these companies, these really high-performing companies. So I think out of the top 20 drivers of the list this year, there were 6 European companies, such as Monday.com, for example, which is one that Avi's invested in.
Besides Eyal being number one on this year's list, what were some other highlights that stood out to you that were maybe different about the 2023 list?
So I think we'd have to acknowledge that the environment is quite different this year than it might have been in previous years. So when creating the list, that did have an impact. So what I'm referring to is really an absence of exit activity, which is a really big aspect that the list and the algorithm is dictated by.
And for the audience, a lack of exits, that means they're not making money back for their investors through IPOs or big acquisitions. Is that right?
I think certainly when we look at how the rankings have been defined, IPOs are a really big consideration. We really do focus on exit activity because we see it as the proven results rather than just book value. But this year, with more of an absence of IPOs than exits, and we have, I suppose, a lot more influence then of private companies or potentially older IPOs, and which aren't directly from 2023, but are still showing signs of very good investment judgment. So it's shaped slightly differently to years where there would have been a flurry of IPO activity, but at the same time, we're just getting a slightly different flavor of investor then, potentially.
How do Forbes and TrueBridge work on this kind of list when maybe there isn't a ton of new activity from a deal standpoint? Does that put any different focus in place, or how does your team kind of approach the list in a year like that maybe is not as easy as one where suddenly a huge IPO just puts a ton of new people on the list?
That's a really great question, and a huge part of the Midas List is the integrity behind it. So even though the environment is slightly different this year, the process actually does stand by the same framework that it would have used in previous years. So that process really has 3 phases. So firstly, we have data validation piece, which is incredibly important. And then we build a Midas model for the data analysis. And then the last thing we have is this independent panel. So that process didn't change. And when thinking about the algorithm as well, it actually didn't go through an intense amount of evolution for this year. We still wanted to, credit those who have made successful investments that have been realized, and also more recent investments as well. So that probably means that the list maybe wouldn't move as entirely dramatically as a year, some of the previous years, but it's still showing kind of rising trends coming up through successful companies in the tech space.
Was it a challenge that there weren't these kind of IPOs, or if not, was there a bigger challenge that you all had to deal with here?
This was something that we were aware of going into the process this year, and as submissions were coming in, and it was certainly top of mind. And it was considered then at all phases, through the data validation, through creating the model, although we did stay true to the philosophy and principles that we had with the model to reward recent exit activity. And certainly with the panel discussion as well, we are able to have that extra element of validation. So validation was extremely important this year.
Because ultimately, the Midas List is fully data-driven, right? It's not so much a buzz score or a heat check where it's like, oh, this person's getting a lot of discussion or is doing well on Twitter. It's ultimately about their financial returns, right?
Yeah, funnily enough, the model has absolutely no Twitter element or field in it at all.
Imagine.
So imagine the algorithm is completely absent of it.
Wow, it's dispassionate and based on data. Who knew?
And in fact, that kind of can shape up the rankings in a way where you see, potentially companies and names that mightn't be as familiar to the general public, but are investors that have incredible performance, and when we look at the data and the numbers, it really does add up.
And some of these names may not be household names, even for people who follow tech. Like you mentioned, Eileen Burbridge, who's a newcomer on the list, great woman investor, but maybe not from one of those huge firms like a Sequoia or an Index that maybe is best known at least within London, right?
You mentioned the firms in London, and when we think of venture capital in the US, and maybe the global Midas List, we think of that concentration in Silicon Valley. And in Europe, one's mind might go to the concentration in London. But when we were putting together the list and seeing the output of the algorithm, we did notice that there is a little bit more of a geographic distribution. So you do have investors in London, but also 0.9 in Germany, and we have companies doing really well in Israel and investors in Sweden, the Middle East. So there is a little bit more of a geographic distribution there.
Is London still kind of the Silicon Valley equivalent, though, where maybe it's the highest concentration of investors? I
think that would be a fair statement to make, that we do see, if we were to pick out a spot as the greatest concentration of top-ranked investors, it's London, but it's interesting to see where the trend is skewing or moving.
Do we have any investors from a place like France on the list this year? I hear about the Paris startup community, but I don't know if any investors actually live in Paris. So we do have Philippe from Eyal, who is, based in London, but is a French investor. Okay, so still based in London. Yeah, so we do, see that if we were to just think of where people are based versus where they might be from, then perhaps there's a little bit less distribution. But as I already said, even considering that, there are people becoming based in more spread out locations across Europe who are having very influential returns, which I think does show the growth and the evolution of the space. Well, Sophie, you're Irish, you lived in London, now you live in North Carolina. Do you think any of these investors who aren't British but move to London, do you think they would ever go back to their home countries to be based, or do you think London stays that concentration? That is a good question, and being Irish and away from home is not that an original of a situation, but I think that it certainly opens up maybe an advantage in deal flow with connections back to different spaces, and we do see tech really being a focus in different countries as an area of development, and a lot of governments taking great initiatives about that, and also in the private space as well. So I wouldn't rule it out. I know in Ireland it's a big thing. We have our
love of tech and innovation.
What is it? Silicon Docks or something is the place in Dublin?
You're not too far off there. Yeah, we have a lot of our beloved Stripe, etc.
Yeah, and to lean into the fact that you are our native Irish Midas Europe participant here.
Mm-hmm.
You probably know some of these companies a little bit better than we might, here in the U.S. Could you maybe tell me one or two companies that you saw were helping people make the list that maybe aren't as familiar to a U.S. audience, at least, but that you and your friends, maybe when you were living in London or in Ireland, would be like, yeah, I know that brand.
Certainly, and this came up in discussions with people like, "Oh, look at this company! It's so impressive. I've never heard of it." And I have all these flashbacks to being like, "Well, I know many people with Monzo accounts, or who have used companies like Otrium or Backmarket, or even wonderful companies like Doctolib in France doing telemedicine." So there is certainly another level of familiarity I'd have with some of these companies, and of course, not to leave out Stripe, which is certainly a household name back home and beloved of the many small businesses that are in Europe and in Ireland, and certainly. So I think that added an interesting element to the conversation around these companies then, and the analysis, certainly for me.
Were these companies driving the list? Did you see any sectors that were standing out, like fintech or security or something like that?
So that is another great question. And it's funny, in 2023, when you think of one sector or one particular trend, one's mind really does jump to generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
But when we look at the Midas List and Midas List Europe this year, we see that really that isn't quite yet at the stage where it's shaping the rankings.
Mm-hmm.
And instead we see some areas that would have been in the media typically more a few years ago, really now converting high potential kind of trends and ideas and spaces into really performing enterprises. And one that stands out is cybersecurity.
Okay.
So someone who came onto the list this year is Gilly Renan from CyberStarts, with a great cybersecurity company, Wiz being a driver there.
Another Israeli investor.
Yes, another Israeli. And then as well, another Israeli investor is Gil Dibner, who has many cybersecurity investments. So
that seems to be a theme. I wrote a cover story about Wiz this summer and got to go to Tel Aviv, and certainly it feels like Israeli cybersecurity companies punch way above their weight, and so it's no surprise to me to hear that the investors coming from Israel tend to have some of these companies in their portfolio.
Certainly, it's definitely an area of expertise in the region,
Mm-hmm.
and we see that then coming through with the performance in the global market.
Yeah. So one thing I know Forbes and TrueBridge have paid close attention to over the years is the diversity of the list, the room for improvement there. Mm-hmm. Looking at this year's list, what's your take on sort of where things stand from that standpoint?
So thinking of the rankings this year, of the top 25, we have 4 women. We also have a new woman on the list, Eyal Burbridge, who hasn't been on the top 25 before. And this is something that we think there's a lot of work still to be done.
Well, Sophie, thank you so much for coming and talking about the Midas List. We look forward to see how things change in future years.
Thank you so much.